Good morning, everyone. We're back for our read aloud of Carrie's War by Nina Bodden. Today we'll be looking at chapter 4, but before I begin to read, let's just take a brief look back at chapters 1, 2, and 3. While we were still in class, we had been talking about the story mountain, or the narrative arc, and this is how the plot of a story works, the different events. In the beginning stage, if you remember from the story mountain, was the flat part called the exposition. It's an introduction of the characters and the setting. I think we have a very thorough introduction to the main character, Carrie, and her brother Nick. We have a fairly good idea about Auntie Lou and Mr. Evans. And we have a good idea of the setting, the big change that has happened in Carrie and Nick's life. Their life in London has sort of been put on pause while they have been evacuated from London during the Second World War and are now in Wales staying with the Evans. So today we're going to start looking at the rising action of the story. Something is going to happen, because if nothing happened, the story wouldn't get very much further, and we've got quite a ways to go. So there's going to be the introduction of a conflict today. And what I'd like you to keep in mind is that this conflict is going to take on different forms depending on the point of view of the character. So one event is going to happen and the different characters are going to have different reactions. It will be a conflict for each one of them, but I think that you'll see that the conflict is quite personal for Carrie. It's quite personal for Nick, quite personal for Auntie Lou, quite personal for Mr. Evans. So they'll all have their own reaction, and that's what we'll be following through the story. Okay, and what I like about chapter 4, so I'm just flipping back to the beginning, is again the picture at the beginning of the chapter, because it gives us a good idea that we might have some sort of an adventure here. What we see are two children, which we can assume are Carrie and Nick, hand in hand, and look where they are. They're in the middle of a large forest, and they're right in the center of it. They're completely surrounded by it. And what are they doing? They're holding hands and sort of peering into this darkness at the end of this. It almost looks like a tunnel. So I think that this image for me, right away, there's some tension created. There's some suspense. I want to know what's inside this tunnel in the forest. What is it that they can't see? It's very mysterious. I think it starts with some suspense, and it tells us that we will have some adventure that begins today. All right, so here we go with chapter 4. Nick had been born a week before Christmas. On his birthday, Auntie Lou gave him a pair of leather gloves with fur linings, and Mr. Evans gave him a Holy Bible with a soft red cover and pictures inside. Nick said, "Thank you, Mr. Evans," very politely, but without smiling. Then he put the Bible down and said, "Auntie Lou, what lovely gloves! They're the best gloves I've ever had in my whole life. I'll keep them forever and ever, even when I'm grown too big for them. My 10th birthday gloves." Carrie felt sorry for Mr. Evans. She said, "The Bible's lovely too. You are lucky, Nick." And later, when she and Nick were alone, "It was kind of him, really. I expect when he was a little boy, he'd rather have had a Bible for his birthday than anything else in the world, even a bicycle. So it was kind of him to think you might feel like that too." "But I didn't want a Bible," Nick said. "I'd rather have had a knife. He's got some smashing knives in the shop on a card by the door. A special offer. I've been looking at them every day and hoping I'd get one. And he knew that's what I was hoping. I looked at them and he saw me looking. It was just mean of him to give me a rotten old Bible instead." I'm going to pause here and just talk about Nick's reaction because I think it's very important. He says, "I've been looking at them and hoping I'd get one, and he knew that's what I was hoping." And we talk about this in our classroom quite a bit, but it helps. We need to express our feelings. We need to say what it is that we want and what it is that we need. We can't imagine that people always know exactly what we want. And here Nick is sort of assuming, well, I was looking at the knives. He saw me looking at the knives. How could he not know I wanted a knife? This is Nick's perspective, but we don't know at this point whether or not this is something Mr. Evans has noticed or not, or whether Nick has actually expressed, verbally said, this is what I want. Okay, we'll continue. Perhaps he'll give you a knife for Christmas, Carrie said, though she doubted it in her heart. If Mr. Evans really knew Nick wanted a knife, he was unlikely to give him one. He thought it was bad for people to get what they wanted. Want must be your master, was what he always said. Carrie sighed. She didn't like Mr. Evans. No one could, but Nick hating him so much made her dislike him less. He's getting us a goose for Christmas, she said. That'll be nice, won't it? I've never had a goose. I'd rather have turkey, Nick said. The goose was to come from Mr. Evans' older sister, who lived outside the town and kept poultry. Nick and Carrie had never heard of her until now. And I'm pausing just to point out, we've not heard of this older sister either. And an important question we want to ask ourselves is, why have we not heard about this older sister? Carrie and Nick have been there for a little while. Nobody's mentioned anything about her, so this is a bit of a surprise. She's a bit of an invalid, Auntie Lou said. Bedfast much of the time now, poor soul. I think of her, but I daren't go to see her. Mr. Evans won't have it. Dilys has made her bed and turned her back on her own people, is what he says. And that's that. She married Mr. Gotobed, the mine owner, you see. So I'm going to pause because, again, it can be a bit challenging to keep track of the characters in this story sometimes. So Dilys is the older sister of Mr. and Miss Evans. Her name was Dilys Evans, but then she married someone whose last name was Gotobed, so now her name is Dilys Gotobed. Okay? Good. The children didn't see, but they didn't like to ask. It made Auntie Lou nervous to be asked direct questions. So they said, Gotobed's a funny name, isn't it? English, of course, Auntie Lou said. That upset Mr. Evans to start with. An Englishman and a mine owner, too. She married him just after our dad was killed down the pit. Dancing on our father's grave was what Mr. Evans called it. The Gotobeds were bad owners, you see. Our dad was killed by a rockfall. That never would have happened, Mr. Evans says, if they had taken proper safety precautions. Not that it was young Mr. Gotobed's fault. His father was alive then and in charge of the mine. But Mr. Evans says all that family is tarred with the same brush, only thinking of profits. So it made him hard against Dilys. So here's the first introduction of a conflict. We have this older sister, and there's been a rupture in the family. Mr. Evans is very, very bitter towards his elder sister because she married the man whose father owned the mine where their father was killed. So this is the first introduction of this conflict, and it might give us a little bit of insight into Mr. Evans' character. I'd also like you to take note that Auntie Lou is the one who's telling the children this, but she's not using her own words. She's telling the children what her brother says, what her brother thinks. So that's an important distinction to make as well. Let's continue. Even now that her husband's dead, he's not willing to let bygones be bygones. Though he was willing to accept a goose at Christmas, apparently. They're always fine birds, Auntie Lou said, as if this was sufficient reason. Hepzibah Green rears them. She's good with poultry. Fine light hand with pastry, too. You should taste her mince pies. Hepzibah looks after Dilys and the place best she can. Druid's Bottom was a fine house once, though it's run down since Mr. Gotobed passed on and Dilys took bad. Needs a man's eye, Mr. Evans says, though he's not willing to give it, and Dilys won't ask, of course. She sighed gently. They're both proud people. Druid's Bottom, Nick said, and giggled. Bottom of Druid's Grove, Auntie Lou said. That's the CWM where the yew trees grow. Do you remember where we picked those blackberries up by the railway line? The deep CWM just before the tunnel? Nick's eyes widened. He said, That dark place? It's the yews make it dark, Auntie Lou said, though it's a queer place, too. Full of the old religion still, people say. Not a place to go after dark. Not alone, anyway. I know I'd not care to, though I wouldn't let Mr. Evans hear me say it. Wicked foolishness, he calls that sort of talk. There's nothing to be afraid of on this earth, he says, not for those who trust in the Lord. Carrie was excited. She loved old spooky tales. I wouldn't be afraid of the Grove, she boasted. Nick might be. He's a baby. But I'm not scared of anything. Can I come with you, Auntie Lou, when you go fetch the goose? Now, I'm going to pause here again because if you look at the bottom of page 54, which is the page I've just finished reading, there are a lot of examples on that page that will help you answer the question I asked you today in the email that I sent is, how does the author create tension, suspense? How does the author sort of really point out to us that she's introduced this conflict? And there's a lot of good information down there. So this is a great place to look when you're answering the questions. And of course, I'll give you feedback in the novel study group discussion tomorrow, and you can give me your feedback and I'll enter it in. Okay, we'll continue. But as it turned out, she and Nick went alone, Carrie and Nick, on what was perhaps the most important journey they ever made together. They were due to go to Druid's Bottom 2 days before Christmas, but Auntie Lou was ill. She coughed all morning, and her eyes were red-rimmed. After midday dinner, Mr. Evans came into the kitchen and looked at her, coughing over the sink. "You're not fit to go out," he said. "Send the children." Auntie Lou coughed and coughed. "I thought I'd go tomorrow instead. Hepzibah will know I'm not coming now. It's getting so late. I'll be better tomorrow." "I'll want you in the shop Christmas Eve," Mr. Evans said. "The children can go. Earn their keep for a change." "It'll be a heavy goose, Samuel." "They can manage between them." There was a short silence. Auntie Lou avoided the children's eyes. Then she said uneasily, "It'll be dark before they get back." "Full moon," Mr. Evans said. He looked at the children, at Nick's horrified face, and then at Auntie Lou. She began to blush painfully. He said in a quiet and ominous voice, "You've not been putting ideas in their heads, I do hope?" Auntie Lou looked at the children, too. Her expression begged them not to give her away. Carrie felt impatient with her. No grown-up should be so weak and so silly. But she was sorry as well. She said innocently, "What ideas, Mr. Evans? Of course we'd love to go. We don't mind the dark." "There's nothing to mind," she said to Nick as they trudged along the railway line. "What is there to be scared of? Just a few old trees." Nick said nothing, only sighed. Carrie said, "All that queer place stuff is just Auntie Lou being superstitious. You know how superstitious she is, touching wood and not walking under ladders and throwing salt over her shoulder when she's spilled some. I'm not surprised Mr. Evans gets cross with her sometimes. She's so scared she'd jump at her own shadow." But when they reached the Grove, Carrie felt a little less bold. It was growing dusk. Stars were pricking out in the cold sky above them, and it was so quiet, suddenly, that their ears seemed to be singing. Carrie whispered, "There's the path down by that stone." Nick's pale face glimmered as he looked up at her. He whispered back, "You go. I'll wait here." "Don't be silly." Carrie swallowed, then pleaded with him, "Don't you want a nice mince pie? We might get a mince pie, and it's not far. Auntie Lou said it wasn't far down the hill, not much more than 5 minutes." Nick shook his head. He screwed up his eyes and put his hands over his ears. Carrie said coldly, "All right, have it your own way, but it'll be dark soon, and you'll be really scared then. Much more scared by yourself than you would be with me. Druids and ghosts coming to get you. Wild animals, too. You don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if there were wolves in these mountains. But I don't care. Even if I hear them howling and snapping their jaws, I shan't hurry." And she marched off without looking back. White stones marked the path through the yew trees, and in the steep places there were steps cut in the earth and shored up with wood. She hadn't gone far when she heard Nick wailing behind her. "Carrie, wait for me, wait!" She stopped and he skidded into her back. "Don't leave me, Carrie." "I thought it was you leaving me," she said, making a joke of it to comfort him. And he tried to laugh, but it turned into a sob in his throat. He hung on to the back of her coat, whimpering under his breath as she led the way down the path. The yew trees grew densely, some of them covered with ivy that rustled and rattled. Like scales, Carrie thought. The trees were like live creatures with scales. She told herself not to be stupid, but stopped to draw breath. She said, "Do be quiet, Nick." "Why?" "I don't know," Carrie said. "Something..." She couldn't explain it. It was such a strange feeling, as if there was something here, something waiting. Deep in the trees or deep in the earth, not a ghost, nothing so simple. Whatever it was had no name. Something old and huge and nameless, Carrie thought, and started to tremble. Nick said, "Carrie..." I'm going to pause here again, sorry, right in the middle of the suspense, but I'm noticing as I'm reading that there's quite a lot of suspense and tension being created on this page. Sometimes we can look at vocabulary, sometimes we can look at punctuation, sometimes we can look at the sentences themselves. So this is page 58, and it's another great place to come back to if you're looking for examples of what the author is doing to create tension in the book. So there's another page to take note of for when you're looking through the answers that you have for the questions I asked you today. Okay? Good. Nick said, "Carrie, listen." "What for?" "Shh." No sound at first. Then she heard it. A kind of slow, dry whisper or sigh, as if the earth were turning in its sleep, or the huge, nameless thing were breathing. "Did you hear?" Carrie said. "Did you hear?" Nick began to cry piteously. Silence now, except for his weeping. Carrie said, dry-mouthed, "It's gone now. It wasn't anything. There's nothing here, really." Nick gulped, trying hard to stop crying. Then he clutched Carrie. "Yes, there is. There is now." Carrie listened. It wasn't the sound she had heard before, but something quite different. A queer, throaty, chuckling, gobbling sound that seemed to be coming from somewhere above them higher up the path. They stood still as stone. The sound was coming closer. "Run!" Carrie said. She began to run, stumbling. The big bag they had brought for the goose caught between her legs and almost threw her down, but she recovered her balance, her feet slipping and sliding. She ran, and Nick ran behind her, and the creature, whatever it was, the gobbling thing, followed them. It seemed to be calling to them, and Carrie thought of fairy tales she had read. You looked back at something behind you and were caught in its spell. She gasped, "Don't look back, Nick, whatever you do." The path widened and flattened as it came out of the grove, and she caught Nick's hand to make him run faster. Too fast for his shorter legs, and he fell on his knees. He moaned. As she pulled him up, I can't, Carrie." She said through chattering teeth, "Yes, you can. Not much farther." They saw the house then. Its dark, tall chimneyed bulk looming up, and lights in the windows. One light quite high up and one low down at the side. They ran on rubbery legs through an open gate and across a dirt yard towards the lit window. There was a door, but it was shut. They flung themselves against it. Gobble Gobble was coming behind them, was crossing the yard. "Please," Carrie croaked, "please," quite sure that it was too late, that the creature would get them. But the door opened inward, like magic, and they fell through it to light, warmth, and safety. All right, we're going to stop there after Carrie and Nick's very important journey through the forest. So what I'd like you to do is go back through that chapter. Lots of tension, lots of suspense, lots of moments where as a reader we're thinking, oh, what's going to happen next? And we feel this sense of urgency. I want you to consider how the author does that. You can take a look at different types of punctuation that you see. The lengths of sentences might be a great place to start as well. Some of the descriptions, some of the characters' behaviors as well. So take a look through all of those things and use that information to answer the questions that I've asked you on today's email. And I think we'll leave it there for now. And we will find out what they find in this house, the light, warmth, and safety of Hepzibah Green's house, and see if we find out what the gobble gobble creature was. All right. Well, I hope you've enjoyed listening to Chapter 4, and I will be reading Chapter 5 sometime this week for us. All right. Have a great day, and feel free to email me with your questions or your contributions to our novel study discussion group. Have a great afternoon, and I'll see you soon. Okay, bye.